Not the green button, Joe, the red button.
I got it, red button.
Good, good.
It's red.
All right, 5 more weeks, folks. Who's counting?
Me.
24 days. My fiance says, 24 days. Every day she comes home. Countdown is on. My grades are due on Tuesday, so I'll be celebrating sooner than that. All right.
How many students do you have?
I've got 150 this semester. Actually, a little bit more.
That's a pretty good load.
Yeah, it'll make it easy here at VCU. University grows, the faculty take on the work.
6 point whatever
Four.
percent raise in tuition.
Right, and that is just barely enough to meet our costs. They were
That's what I figure.
proposing up to 8%, so they wouldn't have to raise it again next year or the year after that. And when they went public with the 8%, people went ballistic.
What was it last year? It was like 5, I think.
I don't think, well, I don't remember the exact figure, but the way that it was explained to me at one of the high level budget meetings is we made a mistake. We should have had a bigger raise last year, bigger increase last year, so we wouldn't have to deal with this every year.
Right.
But from what I understand, the various universities kind of play this game where they won't tell each other what they're gonna do. And so everybody's kind of guessing at what do we, and as the state funding gets harder and harder to get, and now the federal grants and things like that are getting harder and harder to get, you have to raise tuition in order to meet the need, but, it's just a terrible, terrible burden on students and everyone else.
It is.
Yeah.
I got one of those alumni association calls,
Oh, yeah.
and I told him, I said, I'm gonna be paying off this for the rest of my life.
Yep.
And then I hung up. But before I did that, I said, haven't I? I tried to hang up as polite as possible.
They sent me a sticker recently.
Oh yeah, I got that too. And then the guilt trip, like, hey, donate to the.
$56,000
Yeah.
sticker.
I'm like, I still owe you like $1 bajillion. You'll be
Yeah.
sending bills to my grave.
They literally will.
Yeah.
Well, it's not.
Federal
That's
education loans
serious.
they don't
Wait,
mess
you don't
around.
pay VCU though, you pay whatever.
They got their money.
Yeah.
exactly.
Well,
What's up? I went to some of the classes in HIPS and stuff. That holes in the ceiling,
Yeah.
buckets beside me while I was.
Hips is nice though. Hips, they redid it.
yeah,
Well,
it's nice.
Now it-
Yeah, now it is. I was thinking
When I
about
went, it was a total dump, and I loved it. It was, they had those weird corner
Yes, the
rooms
brown.
in Hibbs that had those weird like cafeteria style seats with this like funky plaid 70s carpeting down in the Hibbs dining hall.
Because it used to be the cafeteria.
Yeah, the upstairs one, the upstairs cafeteria, that would catch on fire
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
I was in Spanish class when the alarms went off. It was when they were shutting that down and building, what you call it over here?
Safer.
Shaver.
Yeah.
I love the smoking rooms in the business building.
Oh yeah.
Yes, yes.
Oh, big
That was
time.
awesome. The corner rooms, they felt more smoking rooms. Pretty good.
And the bathrooms in the business building used to smell like open sewage. I don't know
Yeah.
what was up with that. In the business
Because the
building,
alumni
was-
aren't giving us enough money.
I
That's
know,
all
but
it
like
boils
me, they're
down to.
hanging up the phone.
Yep.
That's right.
But
All
now
right.
everything's nice here.
It's getting there. Except for the salaries. All right, which one of you two is first?
I don't care.
I can go first.
All right, let's wait just a second till Alex gets back and then we'll begin. You guys need me to go over the instructions again? We got our introduction, that's me. Presentation, 15 minutes. Nobody else is talking. Response, 15 minutes. You don't talk. We give cool and warm reactions
So I don't talk when?
during our response to your presentation.
The cool and warm?
Yeah, you don't talk during the response, which is 15 minutes. Then you get a reaction time to our responses, which is 10 minutes. And then we have an open conversation of 10 minutes. So you have 15 minutes. And like I said, we'll wait till. Perfect.
I'm
All
still
right.
pretty quick. So if my presentation is just sort of gibberish, I apologize.
I mean, hack all the way through it.
Is this coffee?
Iced tea.
Oh, it is iced tea.
They have sweet and lemon.
All right, sir, whenever you're ready.
How do I present?
Oh, you need that?
Well, how am I,
Do you have your computer?
yeah, I do have my computer, but wasn't it on the
I can
board?
bring, because I can pull up your presentation on through my
Before
email.
it comes out.
Oh, yeah, I've got my computer. Okay.
Oh, here you go. I guess.
I don't know if I'll be able
I
to
think
use
there's
it.
HDMI.
Yeah, I don't know that I have.
Where's the
Port
HDMI
online.
thing?
I think
Maybe?
it's my last time.
Cause you use your app, right?
Right. Check that. Ooh, there it is.
Yeah, so you go ahead and get ready for yours too.
If I have a HDMI.
I got it pulled up.
I got an adapter too. I don't have that adapter.
Well, if y'all could bring it up, maybe I can just talk y'all through it.
Look over your shoulder.
Mm-hmm. All right, and just as a reminder, my role is to just supervise, so I'm not gonna be commenting myself, so you don't need to carry the weight for us.
Okay, everybody got it up? Oral history of school desegregation in Virginia.
You're good, you're on the,
Let me know if you want.
oh yeah, I do, thank you. Perfect.
Okay, so, this is, a project, and it's for my, English 11 class, so this is an English project, not a history project per se, even though it does have a historical theme. And this is, basically about recording an oral history of school desegregation in Virginia. And I'm doing it with my Mass Communication Specialty Center kids. So these are kids that have already learned how to use the AV equipment, they've already know how to use cameras. So that's one of the reasons a lot of that stuff I'm just sort of taking for granted in this, that they already know some of the fundamentals of this. My driving question is, what was the process of school desegregation in Chesterfield County, Virginia, from Brown v. Board in 1955 to full integration? So this is kind of our central question to kind of think about, to bring it back to our current kind of situation in Chesterfield County. The product of it is going to be, we have a CCPS Mass Communication Specialty Center webpage, and I was thinking we could have a special tab on it where we upload the videos or audio. These will probably be videos telling school disintegration. These are resources that I've just sort of clipped together for the kids. A general civil rights timeline from the History Channel that I found was pretty good. A guide for questions from StoryCorps, kind of about the oral history aspect of it. StoryCorps is something from NPR that's really good about recording oral histories. And this is a really good link. If you click on that third link, that's from ODU, and that's a desegregation of Virginia education timeline, or DUB, and that's kind of the abbreviation that I use throughout this DUB thing. So a step-by-step guide to oral history, and then there's a good article by about a sort of pioneering from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And then there's a really good link to the Library of Virginia webpage, and I'll, and so then this is just sort of the tasks divided up for the kids, divided into groups: pre-search, interview prep, record interview, edit interview, present video, post video. This is sort of their pre-search, refer to this guide, investigate general civil rights, investigate, and then I've got kind of the links. They're gonna identify the following key things: Brown v. Board, massive resistance. Notice that I italicized the court case. Number 2, identify 3 questions your group has after reviewing the material. And they're gonna click on that collection and complete a soapstone for one of the items. And after all the groups have presented, they're gonna kind of list 3 aspects of DUB that they find particularly interesting, their groups. And that's gonna be kind of something to guide their questioning. Now the interview preparation, I've got the clips from the Library of Congress archives for those interviews that we watched, I think last time we had face-to-face, we watched some of them. So there's a link to those there. And plan what equipment or software you will need. Some of this, I might actually sort of enlist their mass communications teacher, who teaches them the production class to kind of help corral and wrangle them. But these kids already know how to do that stuff for the most part. But then I've got kind of our list for our subjects. We may have some, I contacted the Chesterfield County Historical Society if they might have some leads. And I want, and part of this is I would like for it to be about Chesterfield County, but if they need to, if they have good interviews from all parts of Virginia, that's fine too. And basically the requirements is I want subjects to need to have attended a public school in Virginia from around 1955 to 1970 during DUB, and have memories of what segregated schools were like, and or have memories of schools becoming integrated. So the interview subjects need to have actual experience in this issue with firsthand memories of it. And I want it to be African American and white subjects for the full kind of perspective on this. Make sure your subjects are okay with being filmed, possibly having their interviews posted online. Before the interview, and this is where I'm kind of sneaking some writing instruction in here, I want them to write a nice formal letter or email to their subject requesting, determine what questions they want to ask, and the questions have to be approved by me. And I've got a little link there for StoryCorps, which has a pretty exhaustive, really, kind of list of question guides for it. And make sure you get some questions, get some basic background info, agree with your subject how long they're going to be interviewed. Make sure your equipment, make sure are understood. Just basically, be aware it's a sensitive topic, be respectful, let their subject tell their story in their own way, be polite, basic stuff. After interview, make appropriate edits. Now, that's very loose language. Once again, these kids kind of know this stuff. They actually probably know a lot more about doing this part of it than I do in terms of editing. So I want to edit it, write a thank you letter to the subject. You know, once again, writing instruction, and also it's just kind of the right thing to do. And that's my last slide. And I think that's it.
Okay, so let's go into the, excuse me. Go into the response period, 15 minutes.
And I'm quiet, right?
Correct.
So some of the warm things I had, I love the oral history project idea. I think it's awesome. I thought you had really good directions here and a great setup to have, some good guidelines to make them successful here. I also love the idea of bringing in the Chesterfield Historical Society. I know sometimes it's hard to work with an outside group, but if you can bring them in and get the kids engaged with that, I know the Historical Society in Chesterfield needs that, and getting the kids involved in the community is also awesome.
I like your driving question. I thought it was effective. I like that you used the Richmond Times article to kind of maybe give an example of what a story might look like, and hopefully get them interested in the real hook, and then to get their interest up. And I like the fact that you had them think about what three key questions. I think that was after the interview, after they did it, but I wasn't sure about that. But that has been effective for me. Like, what questions are you left with after you have completed this or read this or interviewed somebody?
I'm kind of with Alex in that I like the whole oral history and the interview process, and then I also like, and I have not seen this done before, but like a formal letter before the interview and a thank you letter after the interview, because I think it does take time out of someone's schedule to do that, and I feel like sometimes kids are just like, I need to get this project done, hey mom, can you find somebody for me, kind of thing. So I think that putting a little more of the burden on them and the formality of it will be very suitable for them, especially when they go to college and stuff and you do this stuff on your own. I really like that.
All right, switching over to the cool responses, I guess. These are more questions than anything else, but do you think your students might need more time with the background information? Are they going to get enough there? Are the resources that you provided enough for them? Or are you expecting them maybe to get some of this stuff from AP US history or in some of their US history classes? I didn't know how long you think this might take. Is this going to be 2 weeks? 5 classes, 3 classes, 2 classes? Just something I was thinking. And then just, what about, do you think you'll get any pushback from parents or anybody in the community about this project at all? So that's, just some questions I had.
I have some questions too. So partly working through the Historical Society to find interviewees, I'm wondering if the students can interview their own relatives as part of that, which might get them more interested. I'm wondering how you're going to make sure you actually get full perspective and how you're going to make sure that you get both African American and white points of view. If you need to have release forms as part of this process, I didn't know what a soapstone was, so maybe you can tell me what that is. I like that you have prepared questions, but one of the things that sometimes happens is that they hear something and they want to follow up. So I'm wondering if they're allowed to ask a follow-up question or ask more information once they hear something that they didn't necessarily know about. And then, having done a couple oral history projects, part about it for my students was actually creating a transcript. And it sounds like you're not gonna have a written transcript for these interviews, you're only gonna have the video. But that often becomes, because it turns out it takes a long time and it's not really a project about typing. How you accomplish that is a challenge for some students. And then one idea I had was, as a final takeaway, not only just having the actual video, but maybe they edit a 30-second trailer of what they think were the most important parts. So they're thinking about, okay, what's the really important meat in this interview, and I'm gonna distill this into it. And I'm sure that's gonna fit with maybe what they're doing in their media class as well. But how do I distill this down and provide some takeaway showing them that I did some learning from this process?
I mean, you said a lot of what I was thinking. Something, I guess, just like something you could think about. I was thinking like it's the Mass Comm Center, right, at Manchester. So I don't know if they do like news production stories, or like if as a class they could kind of put the stories together in like a segment, or like a 30-minute, kind of focus on school desegregation in Chesterfield County, kind of that way, just so that they have a way where they could link the stories. I mean, maybe somebody in the class interviewed someone who went to Manchester during that time, and then someone else interviewed someone, and they had two completely different experiences, kind of like putting that together. Just kind of see. It's more of a suggestion than something.
Do you have any other?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Jake, you got 10 minutes to respond to.
Well, those were, that feedback was all excellent, it really was. Bryce, can you run down what you?
I just, do your students need more background information? Do you feel
Yeah,
like
and that, you were talking about the time thing, basically, the time period for this is gonna be from, probably late next week to before exams. Like, I'm just gonna kinda block that time, and it's just gonna be, we're just gonna kinda let it roll. Cause we really don't have any other pressing matters in that class, so we're just gonna kinda see what happens. And this is my first time doing it, so, but and also in terms of population, if I was doing it with a different class, yes, like in terms of controversy, but these particular classes, these two sections that I'm doing it with, I won't. And that's just kind of the makeup of the kids in there.
Sure.
And their parents. It's both of these, they're basically the 11th grade Mass Comm classes as they are now, and I feel kind of lucky that I get to teach them. They're the only honors classes that are predominantly minority in the school. So that in other classes, that might be kind of a sticky wicket, but not in these specific group of kids and these specific group of parents. Everything that Alex said was so good, that all of those ideas, that I hope I remember them, and like the thing about the trailer was really good. The thing about, what else was it that?
Some release forms.
Yeah, the release forms, yeah, I probably need to do that.
If they can go off script.
Yeah, the off script, I'll probably add language in that, because some of these kids are so literal minded that if I don't say that, they'll just do that.
I just did a similar project, and I had the exact problem with it. It was asked exactly.
Cause that's to me, like, when you teach honors kids today, they're so literal minded that they'll do everything, but they can't go off script, so I'll probably have to tell them to go off script. specifically in there. But, and what Ashley said about the school news thing, they actually do that.
Mhm.
The senior mass comm kids do the news thing,
Okay.
but they'll be seniors next year.
Mhm.
So perhaps we could kind of take this from like end of this year, and when they get to be seniors in September, maybe they can take what they did and kind of
Together.
put that together. And just going back to like the background info, that's another thing, like, I'm just gonna give them a couple days on nothing but the background info and just see what they need. Most of these kids are about, not most, maybe 50% are AP US history, but they just took the test, so maybe they might be like already dumping it. But theoretically, but yeah.
Okay, any other response?
Yeah, I think everything, I mean, I was very happy with everything, and, yeah.
Okay, now we have, about 10 minutes or so for conversation about everything.
I thought, if you have these guys going into their senior year, they could use this maybe Black History Month.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
It's something
Yeah.
that they can maybe put a little segment together and have it in February and show it to the whole school, that kind of thing, to bring it home for them.
Do you teach them their senior year too, or is that another?
Well, I do end up teaching them, but not in English.
Okay.
The way it works is I taught these kids in 9th grade,
Mhm.
but then I got moved up to 11th grade.
Oh,
And I also teach a film elective, which they end up taking. So
I love that.
usually I teach these kids like 3 out of their 4 years in high school. They have me. So I will teach them again, and I'll see them again, but I won't have them as English students again. But yeah, they're an interesting bunch, and I've told them that we're going to do this, and they were pretty excited about it. And I'm trying to wait a little bit because they were doing a documentary project in their mass comm classes. So I'm kind of waiting for them to get done with that, get done with SOLs before I kind of launch them into this. But it's like I said, I'm sort of towards the end of next week until first week of June, or second week of June, whenever they've got, and then we're just gonna kind of go at leisurely pace with this to see if we can get it. And another thing, and I forgot to mention this, but about the parents, like, that's just a suggestion if they don't have parents that work, because a lot of them, their parents aren't from Virginia or whatever, but they can interview their parents, their other teacher. I mean, it's really open for whoever they think would make a good subject for it.
What do you think are gonna be the biggest challenges for you?
I think a lot of the biggest challenges are just gonna be the sort of logistical challenges of it, like getting them to like sit down, getting them to like find time to interview somebody, getting them to kind of go out and do it, get them to give due dates for it and everything, getting them in groups to work together, things like that. Like, once they get rolling and they're able to like get somebody to sit down, they're gonna be fine. Because this will be their second or third, I mean, these are kids that record interviews and things every week. They do something like this. So once they get down in front of somebody that's telling them their story, they can take it from there in a certain amount of, respects. But just getting there is gonna be the biggest challenge.
So where was that three key questions? Where does that fall in?
Well, it's actually, I put it at the beginning, but I think it should be at the end too. I put it at the beginning before it, just because, for them to kind of get thinking about where they want to divide this, because if they don't do that, and that's why I have so much kind of pre-search and things, because they'll be like, what was it like when the schools were desegregated? Okay, have a nice day. Yeah, so, and that's another reason why I'm having them ask questions ahead of time, because I gotta force them to kind of think about it. But I think having 3 at the beginning and 3 added at the end would probably be really beneficial.
Well, I was actually gonna suggest, and I wish I had done this somewhere else than I did, having 3 key questions in the middle.
In the middle.
So they've done the interview and they've thought about it a little bit, and they're like, well, what is this all about? Like things they didn't realize that they didn't know.
Yeah.
And that's when they're generating the actual historical questions on their own, and they're actually really curious about that. Because I think one thing I found was that my kids discovered things that we hadn't covered in the background,
Yeah.
right? But that would be beneficial for them to know to get to the
Mhm.
final part, if that makes sense.
You know, we're focusing so much here in these sessions on primary sources, and I was curious if you thought, you had that one newspaper article about Nellie McLeod. I don't know if you thought about other primary sources from the time period that might be useful to getting them thinking about questions and stuff. Yeah, that's what I was curious. You know, Chesterfield doesn't have a local newspaper per se. They're caught up in between the Progress Index and the Times-Dispatch. But you have access to those here in Richmond. There may be even the Times-Dispatch at the Chesterfield County Library, where you could have students go in and look at microfilm from the time period. You could look at,
Oh, wow.
you know, you could look
Yeah.
at the 50s and 60s. Nowadays, all of those have been digitized by the Times-Dispatch. And so if the Chesterfield County Library has the digital access, they could actually go in, pull up the Richmond Times-Dispatch and keyword search Chesterfield. They could bring up all the articles type in like Chesterfield school desegregation, bring up all the articles that deal with school desegregation in Chester, and then use those to formulate their questions, use those to kind of
Yeah.
look for names, right? Because Nellie McLeod, her son Charles, and many others would be amazing people to interview for this process.
Yes.
And the newspaper articles would report and oftentimes list the names of the students who were integrating, at least during the first few years that it happened, so you might consider that.
And that's from the public library would have those?
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So nowadays, the Times-Dispatch is digitized and universities like VCU has access to it. Public libraries, I think, would have either copies of it, like hard copies, or microfilm copies, or they may be paying for this digital access also.
Okay.
I would strongly suggest that you kind of investigate to see
Absolutely.
you know, because the Central Branch Library is right there, you know, over by the courthouse, and, you know, so you have access to that.
On Iron Bridge?
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
Now what you were saying about soapstone, it's just a little technique for analyzing documents. It's big in AP Lang, it's big in some history classes, and what it is, yeah, it's like subject or speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, so on, and you basically, it's just a way to kind of dissect
Got it.
something.
Do they get like a document or, you know, something, you know, tips for interviewing subjects?
I put
or-
some links on there for them to kind of go, and I was also gonna ask their mass comm teacher.
That's what I was thinking,
to
maybe
kinda-
that's already.
Because they've
maybe-
probably already learned some of
Yeah,
them.
but a friendly, you know, a little reminder before they get
Yeah.
into the interview wouldn't be bad.
Yeah, because like I said, their big project for their other classes, they had to do a documentary or little mini documentary that had interviews in it. So this is gonna be they've learned some of this already, which is gonna make this, for me, a bit easier, I think, than having to go from the ground up.
And the Dove website does have some tips on conducting oral history interviews related to school desegregation.
Oh,
so-
who's the guy that we saw this summer? I don't remember his name. The guy that did the oral history
Oh, the guy from
Oh,
EDA.
you're talking about
Yes.
Derek Ulrich.
Yeah, that would be a great resource.
Yeah,
too. That
teachers,
was-
teachers So when I taught a class in the civil rights movement in Virginia, this was one of the options students had for their final project was to conduct an oral history with a civil rights activist. And I think the most difficult part was locating people and arranging interviews and, you know, kind of get, like you were saying, the logistics of it ends up being a lot more difficult than you might imagine.
Yeah.
Some African Americans may not want to talk about it because the memories are difficult in some cases.
And I'm kind of hoping that they'll be able to find people in their families
Mhm.
that can talk, so that kind of barrier would be.
Mhm. And then most whites of the time period will either give you one of two responses. You know, they'll either say everything was fine and they don't remember any problems, or they won't want to talk about it because they won't want to come across, particularly on film, as being racist. And so even if they opposed it at the time, you get them on a taped interview in 2018 and you have a difficult time getting the full perspective, I'll put it
Yeah.
that way. Yeah. And so I think Ashley's point about juxtaposing interviews and really getting the students to do follow-up questions, as Alex mentioned, you know, it's gonna be crucial because otherwise you'll get kind of superficial information about the process. Mhm. Trying to think if there's anything else I would, you know, just kind of add, you know, I think reviewing the questions is definitely gonna be important to make sure that they're relevant.
Yeah, and that's also something I want to approve their subjects too.
Right.
Like I want to go through that. And I don't know if I made that clear on that, but I'd always intended that you're going to talk to me about who you're interviewing and why
Mhm.
before we get to that.
Yeah. And you probably want to know, you know, what year did they graduate? What schools did they go to? You know, those sorts of things so that you can tell, because you're right, if you have, if you're studying the topic of school desegregation, you know, you could say, well, I can learn about this by talking to anybody that was involved in the schools at that time. But really, if you want to learn about the process, you gotta talk to the people who were involved.
Yeah.
Either the first African-American students, or the teachers that had African-American students, or white children that were in classes with those students, so that you get more than just, yeah, I was in school when the first black child came, and they weren't in any of my classes, but, you know, I can tell you what I remember. You know, that might be okay, but if you really want to learn.
If I want anything in depth.
Yeah.
And if some of that, we might get some of that.
Yeah.
And that, I'm not really that worried about. I mean, I want it to be good, but if that happens,
Sure.
because part of this is my first time
Yeah.
doing this project with them.
Mhm.
And a project like this is gonna take a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm blanking on the woman's name, but the woman who spoke to us at Virginia State, didn't she say she went to Midlothian High School?
Lauren Lee.
Yeah, like she might be a good resource where she could connect you
Yeah.
with some people who might be willing to.
And this is, and she went to VSU?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cause I know
For
one of the,
for
there's a
graduate school. Or-
there's a teacher at my school who's very active in VSU stuff, so she might go.
And then what I always tell students to ask at the end of the interview is, can you recommend somebody else that we speak to about this subject? And I always ask, you know, do you have any photographs or document memorabilia from the time period that we could, you know,
Yeah.
and if they're able to ask that in the pre-search, you know, then people can bring photographs with them to the interview, and then you can get those on camera and.
Like ask it in the letter,
Yeah.
maybe?
Yeah, if you know, something to the effect of, if you have any photographs or memorabilia from the time period, please bring it with you on interview day. Something to that, you know, you can get some additional primary sources about the subject matter. Yeah, I think this is fascinating, and I do think the Chesterfield Historical Society will be somewhat responsive.
Yeah, I got a response from them,
Some of the other historical societies will not.
yeah.
But Chesterfield's
Well,
got
and the
a strong
reason that
ethic.
Chesterfield, that's why, because I did the research and I saw that there was a pretty big
Yep.
contingent in there.
Yep.
It's still Dahlmeyer, yeah, no, the woman.
I don't know.
All right, very good. I mean, it's a fascinating project. I think it's really interesting. I'll be curious to hear how it goes. But I think you're right. The first year, you know, get the
I'm gonna
ball
try to
rolling
get it
and
and then, like, if some of them are, you know, oh, I was there, it was messed up, okay, you know,
yeah.
or I didn't see any issues with it, then whatever, but yeah.
You'll get a few really good ones, and that I think will be, you know,
That's what I'm at, if I can get like 2 or 3 of them that are,
Right, that's awesome.
yeah.
yeah. All right, great. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Ashley, would you like to present yours? You've got
Sure.
15 minutes.
Sorry for coughing and stuff. So I kind of got hung up on the idea of the local and the global part of this, and so I wanted to kind of take civil rights and expand it over time, like kind of start with the civil rights era with desegregation and youth movement, and then move forward.
Ashley, how did you share?
I
yours?
sent it in an email.
When?
I think yesterday or day before yesterday, same day you sent yours, it was just later.
I can forward it to you real quick.
Are you sending it to the TPS?
I just, honestly, I copied the email, like, group that you sent.
Oh, and I don't
Over.
think my own name was
Oh,
on that.
yeah, okay,
Okay.
sorry,
So
that's
no,
my
don't
fault.
worry, no,
It should,
It's all
I
good.
just sent it to your CCPS email, or should I send it to the other?
send it to the other, I'm sorry, cause I got this logged in.
I'm sorry.
And what is
Oh,
it?
no.
What is it?
TPS J Tucker @gmail.com.
All right. If you can bring it up and share it with Alex, then we'll all have it up on the screen.
Pop up? Come through?
Thanks, Bryce.
You're welcome.
Here we go.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. That's my fault. So I'm kind of wanting to expand on youth involvement in social movements in America, which starting with the decade of the 1960s and bringing it up to present day. While I know that not all of the topics are focused, specifically on the issue of desegregation, it does get into kind of similarities and differences that youth have experienced through each of these decades in trying to get their movement awareness and across to the public. So I'm calling it kind of more of like a focused inquiry project where I kind of set some of the standards and some of the places for research for the kids to go to, and then they can kind of expand it from there. But to kind of like set the context up for it, it's a 12th grade, all senior AP Gov course, so there's no SOL. I mean, technically there's an SOL, but there's no test for it. And I teach in a upper middle class high school where we have a very small ethnic population, but it is starting to grow. The ethnic population that we do have though are a lot of students from like Asia, like India, and even like China, Cambodia, places like that. So we are kind of missing an African American population. We have a few, and I call it sadly a sprinkling of that. So these kids are not used to having struggles per se. So a lot of the students that were born in other countries and have come to America are the ones that have experienced struggles and that kind of thing. So it's something I kind of want to get across to these kids. We meet 3 times a week, so Mondays our periods are like 50 minutes, and then the other 2 days a week we meet every other day for 90 minutes. So my idea with this is in the AP Gov curriculum, our last unit presently is civil rights and civil liberties. So I'm actually going to be starting this, kind of like Jacob was saying, like literally on Monday, and rolling it out until the seniors' last day. But I'm thinking that next year I'm gonna get way better feedback and stuff from this, and have a better idea of how it rolls, because it will be done more in the middle of the school year as opposed to the end of the school year, because our whole curriculum is being rewritten. So that's gonna be the difference there. It would be more like a marking period 2, beginning of marking period 3 project, as opposed to a end of the year seniors are checking out kind of project. And then to kind of set the scene for it, so I'm putting, kind of focused it a little more towards next year's curriculum with the idea of really branching out with this. So we'll have covered like the founding of America, we'll have covered the interactions of the government, the branches of government on the federal level, and even talk about federal and state, so federalism. The idea of, dual federalism and then cooperative federalism. And my idea is this project would be at the end of our civil rights and civil liberties unit, and in the AP curriculum, it focuses really heavily on the 14th Amendment and the use of selective incorporation for the states having the Bill of Rights integrated and guaranteed to citizens of all the states. It does emphasize court cases, so they will be familiar with a lot of the civil rights and civil liberties court cases, so they're not going into this completely blind, like they don't know anything. So it's kind of an extension to get them to think about this stuff. Excuse me. So the essential question, what I'm going with, is what ways have the youth been instrumental in social movements throughout modern American history? I feel like too often our curriculums drop the ball around the end of the 1960s, and then it's like, oh, history didn't happen, nothing has gone on, and we're just here today in 2018. And I guess really what kind of sparked my idea with this was the Parkland shooting and the reaction of the students there after that. And then when we had walkouts at our school, the lack of participation in getting involved in something like this. It was, I had a class of 30 kids and only 3 went out of the classroom and went to the walkout, and then like I think about 3-4 more, I think I had like about 7 to 10 kids leave. The rest of them just sat there playing on their computers, because the school was like, let's just have a moment here. So that was really kind of like, it resonated with me. I'm like, they don't care, they're so apathetic. So I wanted them to kind of see what other youth have been through over time. So to introduce this focused inquiry, I was going to use like Padlet, which is kind of like an online, it's like, I don't know how I kind of equated it to Bryce earlier, to like a Google Doc or like a message board where you can type on it and you can set the parameters for the amount of time that people can type on it and the number of responses they can have and that sort of thing. And then you can shut it off and you can save it, and then you could post it on, like, we use the platform of Schoology, so I could put that up for each of my classes in their section. But they can kind of talk back and forth, and I could project it, and then we could point out different things like, what are motivations for youth to get involved in social movements, and kind of springboard off of that. I found a really cool clip from the National Geographic Society about why why the youth get involved in social movements. And it was more of like kind of a generalization which would tie into the Padlet idea to see, all right, here's what National Geographic has said from their research, and here's what you guys said from your ideas. And then I would kind of end that discussion with an NPR clip that I found, and I really like this. It was student civil rights protesters from the 60s discuss the March for Our Lives, and it's like a 5-minute clip of like 3 young kids who were involved in that movement and kind of what got them into going, and then kind of what they think of what the Parkland kids have done this, this decade. So from there, I would divide the class into 6 groups for the 6 decades, and there would be 5 kids in each group. So because my class sizes are about 30 to 33, so 5 to 6 kids in each class, and then I would assign them decades to research. So the next little part, the guided focus inquiry, I'm doing the decades 60s through the 20 teens. So for the 60s, kind of the springboard would be the Children's Crusade. And I have like a link to the Library of Congress where they have some of the interviews of people who were involved and that sort of thing. And then I also have another website that I found that has interviews as well from kids in Birmingham from that era. The 1970s, I wasn't sure what direction I wanted to go. There's a lot of stuff that you could do, but I thought since my kids are, college age and they're getting ready to go off to school, why not kind of tie in affirmative action and college admissions. And I have New York Times article, and then some Frontline PBS. There's a documentary that they did on political action of youth in the 1970s. For the 80s is where I went kind of global. It's like American youth's involvement in trying to address the anti-apartheid movement. And so there were protests at Yale and Berkeley with those schools' involvement in investing in, or getting money invested in the school from different sources that were actually kind of supporting apartheid. The 1990s, I went, as a 90s teen myself, I went with the anti-sweatshop activism, which is also kind of a global issue as well. So I have the different organizations that were involved, University of Michigan, University of Arizona, and then I have an article from the time period on 90s teens and how 90s teens are compared and contrasted to teens of the 60s being involved in different acts. To bring it more local, for the 2000s, I did the NOVA Students Protest Congressional Immigration Legislation. This comes out of 2006, and there were a lot of walkouts and protests from students in Northern Virginia, particularly in the Fairfax area. I was able to find a few primary source documents, but I was thinking that the kids in this case could do something where they actually tried to contact maybe some of these people involved, because they would be young enough and probably responsive on social media as well. And then my 20 teens tie-in would be the March for Our Lives. And I have like the actual March for Our Lives website, New York Times stuff that they ran. I would try searching the Library of Congress for some stuff on it. I wasn't really finding anything. I'm sure, it's so recent.
Yeah.
So they're probably still working on that. So that was my kind of setup. So my days 2 and 3, and I'm honestly thinking it would probably be more than this. I was just kind of going with, for right now, what I have in front of me, the time left with my seniors. I'm probably only going to see them 2 or 3 more class periods just because of SOLs and the schedule being altered. But I would give them the following questions to kind of get them thinking, but they're not limited to these questions. But the first one, what motivated students to take action for their cause? What strategies and tactics did the students use to gain attention for their cause? In what ways were the strategies successful and or unsuccessful? How did the political climate of your decade influence the youth's decision to protest? And then the last one, how do efforts of the student activists affect you today? So I want them to see the impact of like what happened then still impacts you today. I always get, oh, it's history, it's irrelevant. No, it's not. It's very relevant. So they would research for a couple days, and then we would put together the presentation. They would share their decades in class, and ideally, and I didn't put it on here, but I would have kind of like a graphic organizer for them to kind of organize different, I guess, what the different groups said about their time period, that sort of thing. and I would hold them accountable in the groups because they are second semester seniors, with peer evaluation sheets to make sure, you know, that they were participating and pulling their weight throughout the thing. Lastly, kind of the last slide here, and this is where I'm like going big next year. I would take this smaller kind of project, and the new thing with the 2019 curriculum for AP Gov is that you need to do some type of project in the real world where you get involved in like a political issue or process or institution and policy making, that sort of thing. So I would have the kids kind of investigate something they're interested in, and maybe they would have like a choice of, you know, whether they wanted to actually do some service learning type of project, or do they want to research a certain topic, that sort of thing, and kind of what they would do if they were to get involved with something. But it would have to, the project requires them to make real world connections. And they have to kind of problem solve it. It's almost like, I don't know how many of you went to VCU, but they have like the service learning through the honors college where, you know, you do all that research and stuff, and then you actually do a project that you put forth. So that's kind of the idea I'm playing with there. It's not 100% developed, but that's where I am. I'm losing my voice. But that's it for me.
Okay, responses?
I like the topic a lot. It's a great topic. I think, sorry. Ooh. I think that today, because, you know, pretty much, I would say, a lot of these kids who were too little for 9/11, they grew up in kind of like the Obama years were really formative to them, and it just seemed like such a, like we had this cool black president, and then it seemed like a lot of this history was over. But now we're seeing that the history's not over. We see things about like the gun control March for Our Lives. We see, you know, ICE detaining families and basically running a Gestapo-like ordinance. Like, so we're seeing that history's beginning. History is never ending, and this is kind of really tied in to that. And I think that's what's so vital about it. I really like all the content is really good. And I really like the slide 6 is so cool. It's got all those different links to all of those different things. The decades student movements. That's really cool. And the historical content is good.
To piggyback on that, I thought it was great context, historical context for the lesson, and the youth component is awesome, especially with Parkland, Youth Parkland going on too.
I really liked your introductory slide. I'm looking forward to listening to the audio clip from NPR, as well as watching the National Geographic film as well. But I think that they did a really good job of setting up the question, which is a really good question.
I like the use of that Padlet. That sounds really cool.
The other things I had were I really liked the inquiry group research questions, and I thought it was really good to help them focus. Those focus questions I thought you're going to get a lot of good material from, a lot of good content there. And then at the end with trying to get them more active in the community and having the service learning piece, I think is pretty powerful for students too, especially seniors that are about to head out. They can learn a lot of lessons there, real world lessons that are sometimes come later in life. They can get from that.
As for the sort of I guess, cooler, but more of like questions that I had, on your day 1, I was wondering if you were gonna have some sort of questions, some guided kind of assignments for numbers 2 and 3 on day one, the National Geographic video clip and the NPR audio clip, just something to make them kind of more actively listen and watch that. And another thing that I questioned that I had, for days 2 and 3, number 4 on days 2 and 3, how did the political climate of your decade influence the youth's decision to protest? That's such a big question. And, you know, maybe this is, you know, maybe you do want it to be, I don't know. But I was like, does that need like guidance in that question, or some sort of scaffolding with it? And I don't know what it is, because I'm not a history teacher, but like, that's a big question.
I had exactly the same thing, actually. I wondered if they had the background to be able to answer that question from all those different decades. And that made me kind of ask a more fundamental question, maybe, is that, and you did such a great job, like, with the decades, but is that the best way to divide up these movements? And it seems like some decades are really powerful, and some of them you kind of had to search to find something that just could fit in that decade. So I'm wondering, maybe instead of doing decades, if maybe just movements itself was your guiding principle, and you could choose from a broader range, and you weren't kind of pigeonholed into a particular decade. But you definitely had the resources there to successfully buy decade. Just wondering if that might be another way to approach it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. Like I said, I don't know the historical to know whether or not, but I think almost by movements might be a little bit more organic way to do this.
Some things for me is, day 4, how long are the presentations supposed to be? I didn't see. Are they gonna take the whole class, or, are these short presentations, are they 3 to 5 minutes, are they 30 minutes? I just didn't know. And then overall, like, how will you incorporate the TPS resources there? My little bit of experience I've had using audio clips, which I thought was good. I think it's a good source to have, but how are you going to keep them engaged? I've noticed that if you use an audio clip, if it's not something visual, sometimes it's hard. So maybe just giving students something to answer, or a couple questions to ponder, so something that they're not, staring at their cell phones while that thing is playing.
Yeah, I was wondering also what form presentations will take. What are they gonna look like? Or sound like?
Yeah.
Any others? Ashley, you have 10 minutes or so if you'd like to respond to.
Okay. I'll start with the project, like the presentation piece. I hadn't fully hashed it out for this year, honestly, because I'm so limited with time with what they have. Ideally, next year, I would like them to have like actual presentations in class where I would set aside some time for that. I know you could go on for hours about this stuff, but I would probably limit them with a group of like 5 to 6 people. I would say 10 minutes is pretty decent. So I would expect it to take a class period to do the presentations. Granted, like I said, you can like keep going down that rabbit hole, but I'm not going to expect them to go, but so far with the time that we have. But yeah, sadly, for this year, it's kind of like if they get something together, I've got it basically set up where it's a presentation, but they're not necessarily presenting. It's seriously going to depend on the time that we have, just because the SOL schedule is really wonky this year with the way that they're doing it, and there's gaps in the time that I'll see them. I'll see them like once or twice next week, and then I won't see them for almost a week again. So it's going to be a little touch and go with that. But yeah, in general, I would say 10 minutes is what I'm expecting, and then like a professional attire, full on like presentation for them. As far as, I'll just go backwards. The audio clips, or the NPR audio clip, I was gonna give them like a transcript to follow along with. And I probably would have some, guiding questions to kind of think about while they're listening to it, just projected, on the board. But I know some, some kids are auditory learners and some are not, so, or some are visual learners, so I would have both modalities, available to them for that. So I guess dividing them up as decades as opposed to movements. I definitely thought about the movements, but I just thought with the amount of kids that I have and the size of groups that tend to be effective, if I have more than 5 kids in a group, it is murder. And then I don't want to have multiple groups working on the same movement because they tend to copy one another and get the ideas and hey, what did you do? And oh, okay, that's a great idea. So I just thought for my personal experience in my classroom that decades would be the easiest route to go. But I do like the movements and I could toy around with that idea because I could throw in like women's lib and Vietnam War and things like that but I just have to sit there and search more, kind of like you guys were saying. I did have to dig around for some of those movements, like the 80s. And I know that there are more out there, but I was trying not to get too far because I kind of really wanted to go with the Berlin Wall or something related there, but I couldn't make it work, so I abandoned ship on that one. Then the scaffolding, yeah, I definitely will have, questions and stuff. I kind of find that one of my periods, my 6th period class every year tends to be my weakest class. And so I would have probably more scaffolding techniques in there. And I'm honestly thinking that a lot of my kids, a problem that I'm going to combat is that they just don't know how to cite sources. They rely so heavily on Citation Machine or whatever it is, EasyBib and all this stuff. They don't, all they know is MLA and maybe a little APA. They don't know Chicago. They don't understand that different, content areas or subjects are cited in different ways. And so, trying to teach that, I would have to solicit the help of my librarians and that sort of thing to get that in there. So, ideally, that would be things I would add in for next year's group more so than this year's group. I think that's I think I hit on everything I wrote down. So, it's kind of weird.
Okay, so fantastic. We have 10 minutes to talk, conversation period.
Yeah, when you explain why doing it by decades, I kind of get it's kind of lesser two evils kind of thing. And sometimes you do have to do that when you deal with big groups.
Yeah.
You just gotta sort of arbitrarily come up with some topics that aren't maybe as strong as others, just because the alternative is just kind of not good, even worse.
I thought you could incorporate the current events, piece that Brian gave us today too, so that's, I'm sure resonated with you as well. I thought it was timely.
I was like, oh yeah, that's great. I didn't even think to look in the Times Dispatch. I was digging through the Post because I pay for a subscription, so I have access to their archives, but I wasn't really aware of what you could access. I hit that limit with the Times Dispatch and was like, you can't look at anything else. So yeah, that was something I thought about.
One of the things I struggle with, but it sounds like similar, is that there's this sense of apathy and sense of and so I'm wondering what kind of question could get at what would cause you to go out in the streets and protest. The cell phone service is down, so then you might get out of the street and protest. But what would how you get at that question? I think is a really important part.
It's
of the answer.
It's really sad because it seems like we had more student involvement in activism and protest over their parents not being able to bring them or Uber Eats, drop them lunches off than we did with the Parkland thing. There was more of an uproar over that and we need Uber Eats, kind of.
You definitely teach in the West End.
My principal put on the front door, and I'm summarizing, but it was parents, if you're bringing your lunch to school for your kid, turn around.
Uh-huh.
Your
Yep.
parent, your student is learning how to be an adult, and
Yep.
if they forgot their lunch, they're just not going to eat today.
No.
But a bunch of parents took pictures of that, and it flew all over social
Yeah,
media.
That's
And she had to take them down pretty much immediately.
Oh, yeah, you
Yeah.
can't do stuff like that.
Yeah.
that's
Well,
essentially.
she loved it for 3 or 4 days. She was like, oh, this is
And then
awesome.
all of a sudden, you get all these angry parents.
Mhm.
Yeah, the county told her to get rid of it.
So that was something else that just floored me. I'm like, you want to protest not being able to have Uber Eats drop you lunch off or mom or dad drop you lunch off, but you don't care about safety in the schools and you're apathetic to everything else. But then they'll go on rants on papers about opinions on political issues. And I'm just like, there's a big disconnect.
Well, it's just also, it's stuff that affects them.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the stuff that they protest around VCU, they protested when VCU was buying all this real
Mhm.
estate so they could take over more of Richmond.
Mhm.
That's stuff that affects them, and they were kind of making the connection, like,
Mhm.
this is stuff that's actually affecting my pocketbook.
Mhm.
Like, this is money in my pocket that
Yeah.
VCU wants. And I think that with some of these things, it is kind of like, and it's things like the healthcare protests. Like,
Mhm.
that was stuff that was actually affecting
Yeah.
people. And I think it's hard for teens, adults, anybody to see things that don't actually affect them and to protest. And these kids feel safe, I guess, so they don't
Yeah.
see the gun violence thing. But a lot of my kids, I think in Chesterfield, we had a ton of kids that do it. And I think part of it, and this is completely unscientific, this is one reason we were talking about controversy with mine. I had 100% participation in the walkout in the class that I'm doing this project for. So that's kind of, but these kids in Chesterfield know. They can, they can point, they can say, that kid over there, completely out of his mind, and his parents have an AK in their garage. Like, they know that. And I think that that's why we kind of had that, because those kids knew that it was something that affected them.
Mhm.
And I think that it's hard to make that jump
Mhm.
with humans, really.
I just had thought about, well, Jake was talking there. Was it the Occupy Wall Street youth movement?
Yeah, okay, so I thought about that
Is it too
one.
weird? Yeah.
Maybe I have some issues with that movement
Yeah.
myself.
No, I didn't. I know. Yeah.
And
I
I
was
just,
just throwing it out there.
I kind of thought the parents in the area that I teach might take issue with that. These parents are very involved, helicopter parents,
Yeah.
and that is totally, you're talking about a conservative area.
Yeah.
And doing Occupy Wall Street. I
that
like
was-
the idea. I don't mind the idea, but I have reservations.
It was a
with
college
Yeah.
movement. It was like a lot of like 20-somethings.
It was definitely one I sat there and researched and thought about, because I was in college when that was going
Yeah.
on.
And it was so sort of general what they
Yeah.
were. It wasn't like, it was kind of nebulous what it was actually in a lot of ways.
I just had a couple of things to add. I thought that this was great. I really liked the lesson. I think the tying it into past and present would be easily done. I like the idea of having the students recognize their own power and their own contributions. So, overall, I thought it was fantastic. When I've used audio clips in my classes, I tell students that they have to close their eyes so that they can't be looking at their phone, they can't be doing anything else, they have to essentially be listening. And that has actually worked in the past, because I've noticed a lot more response when I tell them, what did you just hear? And everybody kind of pitches in. For the children's movements, I wrote down, there was a lot of youth activism on the home front during World War II. A lot of the rationing, a lot of the preserving oils, a lot of the gardening. So there is a lot of youth activism during both World War I and World War II that you could be. The one that my students are totally fascinated with now is the marijuana legalization and the medical marijuana legalization. I think that's been a lot of youth activism as well, so could be one. I don't know how the West End folks would feel with that one either.
Oh, the
but-
kids would support it.
Yeah, I don't know about the parents.
Yeah.
You used the Kids in Birmingham for the 1960s. That's a good friend of mine that runs that website. So if you would ever like speakers or anything related, Ann Jimerson is actually. I'm the co-chair of the Dove
I
Project.
saw that, yeah, I didn't even know that until after I put it in, and I saw that.
And then Ann is the co-chair of that and also runs Kids in Birmingham because she grew up in Birmingham. So happy to help you out in that regard at any point. But yeah, I thought it was great. I thought both lessons today were great, and I thought you guys did a great job giving feedback. And I hope you guys will find it useful when you use them in your classrooms.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no, 100%.
Yeah, great. All right, fantastic. So we've got just about 10 minutes before we reconvene in the big room. So you're welcome to hang out here, get some more food, use the restroom, stretch your legs, and we'll gather in there exactly at 1:45, if not before.